I'm Beth Hessel, the Executive Director, and we are so thrilled to have you here. We see lots of faces of members and regular attendees, but also people who may be here for their very first time. Raise your hand if this is your first time here. Welcome, welcome. We're so glad to have you here. We have here tonight the president of our board, Ned Sharf. You want to stand up and who can attest to you about what a lovely, vibrant place the Athenaeum is. The Athenaeum, if you are new here, we are not just this magnificent old building which is near the Liberty Bell and all the other marvelous things in Philadelphia. We are a living, vibrant community of people who care about books, who care about literature and history, architecture and preservation, about what it means to be alive in our world today. We gather for book talks and author talks and movies and all sorts of wonderful events that allow us to learn and grow together, to engage in wonderful conversation, as well as having a circulating library and a research library and so much more. If you love what you experienced tonight, we invite you to come and learn more. We have membership brochures on the back, as well as down near the front door about brochures on our ongoing speaker series, and staff and Ned and other members here who you can ask more questions about. So we hope that you'll come and continue to be a part of our community. We welcome you. Tonight is a very special night. We have one of our longtime favorite people, Carrie Rickey, here, but she's not doing a Carrie Rickey program tonight. Carrie Rickey leads an afternoon movie group that meets every about once a month or 3 weeks or so. We get together and we watch a movie in the afternoon and have a wonderful conversation with Carrie, who is the former film critic for the Philadelphia Inquirer and an amazing mind. Right now we're looking at French alternative films, and it's been a lot of fun, but we were looking at Buster Keaton a couple of months ago. But she's here tonight for our guest of honor, Dana Stevens, who is the film critic at Slate magazine. And let me tell you, Tess, who's in the back, and I have been having fun for the last couple of hours listening to Dana and Carrie talk about movies and so much more. So I think we're in for a treat tonight. Dana is the film critic at Slate magazine and a co-host of the magazine's weekly culture podcast, the Slate Culture Gab Fest. And now she's lots of family and friends here, so you already know all that. She's also written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and Book Forum. She lives in New York City, but has family here in Philadelphia, so we're so glad that she was able to come down talking about her book tonight on Buster Keaton. So I think this is going to be a wonderful conversation between Dana and Carrie. We're in for a treat. And they thought that we would start with a little bit of Buster Keaton. And they gave me the whole run-through of what I was supposed to say, and I asked Carrie to simplify it for me because I'm not as smart as them when it comes to movies. But what we're going to be watching is a clip from a 1924 Buster Keaton film. In it, he plays Sherlock Jr. So Buster's a projectionist, and some of you may have seen this film when we showed it a couple of months ago. So Buster, the projectionist, falls asleep on the job. And during his dream sequence, which we're going to watch, he tries to solve the mystery of the movie that he is watching. So we're going to roll this film, and then Dana and Carrie are going to come up and have conversation and Q&A with you. So I invite you, first of all, let's welcome our guests, Dana Stevens and Carrie Rickey, and watch the show.
Good evening, and thank you for coming tonight. It's so wonderful. This movie is almost 100 years old, and it seems so fresh still. Why do you think that is, Dana?
I mean, I guess you got to read the book to find out. I mean, I think that this even out of context, just seeing a little moment from the middle of Sherlock Jr., you can get a sense of what an inventive filmmaker Keaton was in his time. And just to have the idea, not only of climbing into a movie screen, but to have it turn into this long, extended joke that's really about filmmaking and about editing, right? And about the strangeness of how editing can take you to a completely different place than you were before. Something that can't happen on the stage in the same way. So he's exploring the possibilities of film always in what he's doing and thinking about film.
And just to begin, Cameraman is a terrific, terrific book, and you all should get a copy. And it's, for me and Dana, I met him first, so he's mine. He was mine first before he was yours. Let's put it that way. I'll share. Keaton is one of the film's most remarkable figures. He was a child vaudevillian who drifted to Hollywood, where he picked up a movie camera, took it apart, put it back together again, and proceeded to use it the way magicians use sleight of hand and metaphysicians use first principles. He approached it with logic and linearity, which movies aren't. They're illogical and nonlinear. For me, he was silent cinema's most imaginative filmmaker, the possessor of one of the screen's most infinitely watchable faces, and one that topped the movie's nimblest body. I think we agree on this. So in the book, Dana Stevens asks questions that I had figured were unanswerable, namely, who was this solemn, beautiful, perpetually airborne man from what alternative universe, seemingly possessed of its own post-Newtonian laws of physics, had he been flung? How could anyone be at once so physically agile and so timelessly funny? And she answers all those questions in under 300 words. So.
Well, it's actually 432 pages.
Oh, sorry. Under that. But she does so with an ingenuity and originality worthy of its subject. So, Dana, for starters, your book isn't one of the standard cradle-to-grave biographies. It is like a tree that goes out to certain branches and takes tangents and incorporates a lot of cultural history that was on a parallel track to that Keaton Road. Describe the kind of book it is. How would you describe it?
Okay. Before I answer that, I just want to make sure, can everyone hear? Are we well mic'd enough? Yeah? Okay. Yeah, I mean, this is something that I feel like I say over and over, and I don't want it to drive people away from the book. If they're looking to learn about Keaton's life, they will certainly learn about it from the book, but I don't think of this as a biography, and I spent a lot of time sort of warning or promising, I don't know which it is, telling people, wait, it's not really a biography if that's what you're looking for. There is a big doorstop-sized Keaton biography that's about to come out in just a couple of weeks by an author named James Curtis that I haven't read yet, that I'm excited to read, but that I think is more traditional cradle-to-grave, as you say, that really is sort of, how much money did he make in, this transaction, and, what was he doing in this month of his life. This is much more of a cultural history, and the way that I like to characterize it is it's a cultural history of Buster Keaton's lifespan. So he was born in 1895, and he dies in 1966. So that's only a 70-year span. It's not a very long. I mean, it's a the biblical span of 70, but it's not an insanely long human life. He got a lot done in it. But if you think about American history during those years and how the world changed between 1895 and 1966, right? I mean, it's a different universe. Just the changes in technology and communication and women's rights and race relations and all of those things happened during his life. And in many interesting ways, they happened kind of in tandem with his life, in ways that crisscrossed with his life. And so that's sort of what the book is. And a friend of mine put it very well, a way that I hadn't thought about thinking of it, but when she first read the book, she said, oh, what you're looking at is the way history moves through someone's life. You know, you could really pick anyone, even someone not famous, and say, well, how does history move through their life and express itself in their life? But he's a particularly fascinating figure to do that with because of all the worlds that he crisscrossed through.
Okay, where were you when you first encountered Buster, and was it love at first sight or something else?
Yeah, I mean, it's a story that I tell in the introduction, so if you read just the first 3 pages of the book, you'll know the full version of this story, but it was relatively late in my life, even in my life as a film lover, that I discovered him. I was in my late 20s, and even though I had grown up, I mean, at that point, I had been a hardcore cinephile since probably age 13 or something like that, but growing up in suburban San Antonio, Texas in the 80s, I mean, VCRs were barely invented. Certainly, I was not going to silent film retrospectives. I know some people grew up in places where silent films would be shown on TV on Sundays, but that certainly never happened where I grew up, so I just didn't have a chance to see those movies. And probably, like a lot of people that I've talked to in the course of talking about this book, I probably kind of mixed up Keaton and Chaplin and Lloyd and just like all those black and white funny guys in silent movies. You know, I probably had a vague sense of who they were, but didn't really sort them out terribly well. But then, when I was a grad student, I spent a year in France, in Strasbourg, up in Alsace in the north of France, studying and working on my dissertation, which was nothing to do with film or Keaton or anything like that. But because it was the centenary of his birth that year, he was born 1895, and I was there in 1995, there was a great retrospective of his work that was shown at a little cinematheque near me, and I had a student card that made it really cheap to get in, and I just got addicted to seeing his movies. And that's when, when I had that, those sentences that you read about who is this perpetually airborne man, that's when that question kind of struck me. So that was a long time ago. It was probably 20 years after that date that I actually signed a contract to write this book. But all that time, I had been thinking about Keaton. I read all the biographies that were there and started to branch out from that and look at silent film more generally. And if something came along that happened in that time span, 1895 to 1966, I was interested in it. And I would try to map it onto his life and say, what was he doing at that moment? I wonder what his reaction was. Did he, see Some Like It Hot by Billy Wilder? And it turns out he did, and he loved that movie. But I was always sort of trying to chart a course through his life in that way. So when the book project came along many years later, this is another story, but I ran into the right editor, which is a really important thing in writing a book, and found someone who thought that was an interesting way of framing a life. And even though he didn't know much about Keaton or film, said, I think that you have an original vision for a book, and you should write it. So that's sort of how it came to be.
Well, it's a book that is equally interesting to movie geeks like me and people who know nothing about movies, because it's such an interesting life and such a magical life in many ways, and sad life, and the sections of the book are about flying and falling and landing, or those are the three.
Well, yeah, the kind of image, the image at the heart of the book, and this is all in the intro too, is just that this Keaton, who you have to realize when he was a small child in his family's vaudeville act, was a projectile, literally. That was his role in the act. He was a little kid. He was especially small for his age, extremely agile, obviously. And the basis of the act was his father picking him up and throwing him around the stage. It was sort of like
and drop kicking him like a football.
Yeah, and just all kinds of mayhem that they would spontaneously improvise and do things every night. And this act was a big hit in part because of the violence of the act, or the apparent violence, the shock that this little kid was being treated in this way. So that image really stuck with me and haunted me, obviously. And I talk about that early in the book, and about child abuse laws and child labor laws at the turn of the century, and like what it meant to be a 5-year-old being thrown around the stage for a living in 1890, whatever year he started, 1899. But now I've lost my train of thought. What was I talking about? Oh, I know. So that he's this projectile from childhood, a literal projectile being thrown on the stage, and then the metaphor from that for me became that he was a projectile being thrown into history, so that he goes sort of flying out over the course of the 20th century and accomplishes so many things. I mean, before he ever stepped in front of a camera, he was a big star in vaudeville, a child star, not just sort of a trained kid in his parents' act, but really the creative driving force behind the act that made it funny and that made them famous. And he goes straight from that into movies, and without missing a beat. There's no steep learning curve for Buster Keaton. He suddenly immediately switches to a completely different medium and starts doing amazing things in that medium, which, as you saw, can only be done on film. Things like those editing jokes in that little segment. And then, as you say, there's also a big fall, as there often is in show business stories, especially ones involving child stars, is that after having this, essentially unbroken upward trajectory of success for the first 30 or so years of his life, he makes what he calls the worst mistake of his life and signs a contract with MGM Studios, a big corporate studio, at the moment that sound is coming in. And if you know anything about his life, the next few years for him were very hard. He started to drink too much, his marriage fell apart, he was completely creatively unchallenged and miserable as a contract player at a big studio, without having any creative control over his movies. And so he just fell really hard and fast, and that's a hard part of his life to write about. But something that I also wanted to write about, and this is the last part of the book, is called Landing, right? So it's part 1, throne, part 2, flying, part 3, falling, part 4 is landing. And he really did land safely and well and spent the last third of his life finding lots of work, whether it was in television, early television, which he was constantly active in, or, touring in summer stock plays or bit parts in movies, and, making ads. And he was never not working. He loved to entertain, he loved to work, and he needed to make money because from the age of 5, he was supporting his whole family, his family of origin, later his kids, his ex-wives. I mean, he was a guy who felt like a lot is on my shoulders. And, the last half of his life, I think, was really about clawing his way back to being someone who was making a living in show business. And I love the end of his life. I never agree with those kind of characterizations of Keaton of sort of, then he started to drink and it went downhill and it was all tragic. No, it's a really inspiring story of someone finding meaning and finding work that means something to them and love.
No,
in
and
the last half
it's
of their
the
life.
first writing about Keaton that talks about how when he finally finds the right woman,
Right.
Things go very well, and she shares his life, and she keeps equilibrium in the relationship.
Yeah,
and
well, the last chapter of my book is about her. It's called Eleanor, and it's all about his widow, Eleanor Keaton, who outlived him by many years and became a big kind of protector of his legacy, and seems like a really amazing woman in herself. So yeah, I was trying to do justice to his life and the personal stories in his life, and also to bigger stories about, the political, cultural forces that impacted his life.
Why do you think that vaudeville was such an important launching pad for so many people who became Hollywood gods and goddesses? We have Mae West, we have Fred Astaire, we have Sammy Davis, so many, W.C. Fields, so many really important figures in the culture start from vaudeville. And I always thought they know when the act is connecting with the audience. They have that feeling. What other things do you think?
I mean, at the beginning of film history, when before Keaton got into the movies, when he was born, I think it really was just that there was nowhere else. I mean, vaudeville was the primary form of American entertainment at that time, and he got in at the very height of that, was really in the golden age of vaudeville, and then just as it kind of started to get beaten out by the movies, he joins the movies and gets in on the golden age of that. But that was just sort of where there was a talent pool to draw from, I think, at that point. Then later on it changed a little bit after radio came along, and you would have people like Milton Berle, who started off as a vaudeville comic, then became a radio star, then became a TV star. He skipped the movies entirely,
Right.
And found another trajectory through entertainment.
But I guess the foundational figures of early movies came from vaudeville.
Most of them, yeah. Most of the ones I write about in this book did. Well, Charlie Chaplin was the English music hall, which is a little bit of a different tradition, but similar.
Parallel.
Right. But I mean, to me, it seems natural. That was sort of the feeder,
Right.
And in fact, I write about this in the book too. There was a lot of tension between the theatrical and the filmic sides of entertainment. And for many years, if you went to see a vaudeville bill, it would be various things: the Three Keatons, the performing elephants, a guy juggling with his feet, whatever, a bunch of crazy vaudeville things. And then they would show a movie. They would bring out a projector and show a little movie. And that was the technological novelty at first. Like, look at the amazing new machine that can show moving pictures. And only gradually did the movies themselves start to tell real stories and take over. And that all happened in exact sync with his life. Because something I forgot to mention about 1895, the year of his birth, is that it's the year traditionally celebrated as the first year of movies, the first year that movies were projected on a screen for people to see. You could watch them in little kind of, peep show things with a crank, but you couldn't actually sit like we just did now and look at them on a screen. So that came into being this exact same year as him, and it grew up along with him, and that's just really interesting to trace through his childhood.
Well, you return to 1895 a lot in the book.
It becomes a running joke how many things happened in 1895.
Well,
yeah.
it's clearly 1895 was the time that the seeds were sown that created the 20th century. And talk about Freud, talk about the other things that come
I can't remember now. I mean, I know that when I was looking into that year, I sort of thought, well, to understand the context someone was born into, let's look at the year. And then I just started to see, and now I'm not going to have all of their names at mind, but how many important artists were born in either that year or right around then, how many important events happened then. The film projection is one I just mentioned, but radio waves were transmitted for the first time over a long distance. Basically, the beginnings of radio, which is also the beginnings of the internet and Wi-Fi and all that, happened in 1895. There were all kinds of important events in women's rights, in the women's movement, in race relations. There was a famous speech by Booker T. Washington that happened in 1895 that kind of split the black intelligentsia between, the more gradualist kind of integrators and the ones who were a little more firebrands, like W.E.B. Du Bois. Anyway, all that stuff was happening and bubbling in 1895. So it just occurred to me that to be born into that year, you could probably say the same of any year in history, but once you start digging in and saying, what does it mean to be born in that year? You learn so much about history through that person.
It was definitely, when you read the book, a year of incredible change. And for me, I think someone once said everyone has her own personal Jane Austen. I think everyone has their own personal Buster Keaton too. And for me, Buster Keaton was a cubist at the same time Cubism was happening, and he was a surrealist at the same time, or he was even an early surrealist. I mean, in the movie we just showed, we're watching a three-dimensional man go into a two-dimensional space, and that was kind of hallucinatory. Cubism is a lot about the different dimensions, flatness and dimension side by side. And he seemed to embody all these kind of radical art movements. And he had a very logical mind and an analytic mind. For someone, he was formally educated how long?
I mean, he really never was. He never went to school. He had a story he liked to tell in interviews that he spent one day in school because the authorities made his parents put him in school, and he just sort of wisecracked all day and then got thrown out. But he didn't live anywhere when he was a child. He was peripatetic, constantly traveling vaudeville performer, so he didn't really have any home to go to school in. But he was obviously a very intelligent man, but an extremely unpretentious one, to the point that, Carrie, what you were just saying about the surrealism and cubism and those connections with his work, they're so clearly there, but he would never have known that, and he would never have cared about that. And he was not someone who considered himself an artist, even, really. I think he thought of himself as a technician and a clown and a stuntman and a guy who could make people laugh. But, certainly when he made a scene like what we now see as this very, avant-garde scene of the guy climbing into the screen, he wasn't trying to say anything or make statements about art. He was really trying to solve a technical challenge, and he and his cameraman, whose name was Elgin Leslie, who had the idea for that scene, were just really excited to create the illusion, to make it look as if he was climbing into a screen. And what you're actually seeing there is a stage set that's lit in a very flat way to look like a movie screen, right? So he was actually stepping up onto a stage and being thrown off by that guy. He wasn't interacting with an image, in other words, but they really managed to create that illusion. And he loved to do that. He loved that kind of camera trickery.
Let's see. What was the transition from the end of vaudeville for Keaton and the beginning of the movies? How did that happen?
You mean in his own personal life?
In his own personal life, yes.
Okay, well, I don't want to spoil too much of the story about his family, because it's a big turning point in his life, and it's a suspenseful moment in the book. But his father, especially in his teenage years, started to become alcoholic, started to become abusive, was not a good person to work with on stage anymore in these very precise routines that involved, kicking and throwing and all kinds of dangerous things. And there just started to be some really volatile incidents where his father would act out, get angry at theater managers, and once he broke all the furniture backstage at a theater in Providence, Rhode Island, and that sort of put the Keatons on a blacklist, and they had to go down a rung to a less prestigious vaudeville circuit. And things were just they were no longer kind of riding as high as they had been before, and they were just a miserable family. And at a certain point, Keaton tells this story much later to his biographer, that his mother, Myra, who was also part of the act and had been touring with them all those years, took him aside and just said, "I can't take it anymore. I want to leave your father. We're gonna leave him behind at the next stop." And so there's this story that he sounds like he's still shocked that they did it, even when he's telling the story in his 50s or something, that he and his mother just left his father at a stage door with his trunk and didn't tell him where they were going and took off by rail across the country and broke up the act. The father did eventually somewhat reunite with the family, but the act was done for, and Buster Keaton found himself having to figure out how to reinvent himself as an entertainer. He at first thought that he would go on stage and just become a solo act in vaudeville, and as he was, and this is a chapter in the book too, as he was sitting around figuring out how to do that, in this few days that he had before he was going to start in a new stage show as a solo act, he met indirectly through another vaudeville friend, Roscoe Arbuckle, Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle, as we call him, although I try to call him Roscoe in the book because I really do think it's terrible he's remembered to history by a name he never wanted to be called. And they went into business together and started making short pictures. So yeah, that transition really just happened because of a chance encounter, like so many things happen in life. But Arbuckle later said that he immediately knew that Keaton was destined to become a filmmaker. He said he lived inside the camera. That's a great quote that he said about him.
Actually, Arbuckle is very instrumental to Keaton's career, and Keaton inherits Arbuckle's studio, really, called Komiki?
Komiki, they pronounce
Komiki,
it, yeah.
Thank you. It's spelled comique, but yeah,
They thought they were being French, I think.
Yeah,
They pronounced it that way.
And talk about how the structure of Hollywood was beginning to change. I mean, Keaton is put in this, basically he's an independent, he's an independent who does everything. He hires his own people, writes his own material, and he's an independent at the same time. Studios are beginning to buy up the independents and consolidate into studios, very hierarchical, top-down places. And Buster was in the right place at the wrong time, or he was in the right place for 10 years.
Yeah, no, he had a pretty good run.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, there was this kind of Wild West period at the beginning of early Hollywood where there wasn't any studio system. What there essentially were sort of patronage mills. You would find a producer, and Joe Skank, the producer who was in charge of Buster's studio, was also his brother-in-law, so that helped. It was like a family affair. But you would find a patron who would set you up with a studio, and that meant, okay, I have a lot, a single block of a city, and I've got my own cameraman, my own set designer, my own wardrobe woman, just some small skeleton crew of people who are on the same page as you, and who think your jokes are funny, and who get your sense of humor, and who want to create the same kind of things that you do, And that's the way Keaton worked from 1917 when he joined with Arbuckle, who had a similar situation, through inheriting that and getting the Buster Keaton studio all through the 20s, all through the silence that we see. That was really him operating in freedom and in creativity and at the top of his powers. And then there's this moment with MGM in 1927 that comes along, puts an end to all that. But it really, that was something that was happening in the industry anyway. There's not really any way you can retell the story and say, if only he hadn't signed that contract, if only he'd kept independent, because it really was the whole economy of filmmaking that was changing. There wasn't going to be any space anymore for things like, oh, I have a dedicated crew that just sits around waiting for me to have ideas. Chaplin continued to have that because he was incredibly wealthy. He was so wealthy and famous that
Chaplin
he could do
had
it
an
as long as he
international
wanted.
market.
Right.
And Buster didn't. He might have later, but I mean.
I don't know. I mean, the French really loved Buster, but silent film in
Yes.
general didn't survive extremely well internationally either.
But Chaplin achieved a kind of stardom by
That's
1915.
true. Right. I mean,
He wa-
Chaplin was so much more famous than anyone else that he sort of invented fame. You know,
Yeah.
you can't really compare the two of them in terms of, yeah, right? I mean, along with Mickey Mouse, like he invented fame.
Yeah, no, I mean,
And Buster
Chaplin
Keaton
was
was-
Mickey Mouse before Mickey Mouse.
Right.
Yeah.
And so even at his most famous, I mean, you know, Buster Keaton was certainly a famous, rich movie star, household name in the 1920s, but he was nowhere near Chaplin's level. And he
Right.
didn't even own stock in his own studio. I mean,
Well,
to give you an idea of what a horrible businessman he was, he really just, he had no idea how to handle his money and, you know, always entrusted it to other people, and that got him in lots of trouble throughout his life.
It's very interesting how, as a personality, he was very passive. I mean, he basically, I feel, got shoved into this marriage with Natalie Talmadge. And his brother-in-law, Joe Schenck, is basically making business decisions for him. And he never thinks as Chaplin, as Harold Lloyd, owning his own content. You know, that he just wanted to make it. He didn't,
Right.
he didn't care about it. For him, it was about the making and not the ownership. And that turned out to be not a great decision.
Yeah, well, and then later in life, that was a bad business decision for him because he wasn't making money from his own movies being
Right.
rediscovered. Then there was a period in the 60s where he started to realize, wait, this is actually important to preserve this stuff. You know, let me go dig through my old vaults and try to find my moldering film reels.
Tell him, tell him the James Mason story.
I mean, the brief version of the James Mason story is just that James Mason, the actor, and his wife owned this house, the Italian Villa, that was a gorgeous, you know, classic Beverly Hills mansion from the 20s that had been Keaton and his wife's house during their heyday in the 20s. They were miserable there, but, you know, it was the period when they were living that picture-perfect movie star-looking life. And much later in the 50s, when he wasn't living that life, but was much happier with his third wife, James Mason was living in that house and discovered, I believe it was in a shed next to the house or something, they were cleaning out a shed and they discovered that there were all these film reels that were rotting away, that were, you know, classic Buster Keaton movies, many of which didn't exist anywhere else because studios weren't saving that stuff. They didn't value it at all at that phase. And so, yeah, then there was an encounter between the two of them where it sounds like Keaton went to the door and knocked on the door of his old house, the Italian Villa, and Pamela Mason, the wife of James Mason, wouldn't let him in. And the reason she wouldn't was that she was embarrassed what they had done to the house. She thought they had made it less beautiful, and, you know, they had changed the finishes or something because they had cats. I don't know, it was some crazy, you know, she didn't want to let him in, but he really took it to heart and sort of felt that he had been turned away from his own former home. But he did manage to get those reels and start restoring them. And by the time he died in '66, not all his films had been rediscovered and restored, but they were really starting to be, and he knew that. So I think he died happy about that.
Yeah, because when I grew up in the 50s and 60s, you could see Harold Lloyd movies, you could see Charlie Chaplin movies, but there was only, you could only see fragments of Buster Keaton. Even the Raymond Rohauer had started buying them up. The person who bought up a lot of Keaton movies was charging such exorbitant rental fees to movie theaters that it was really hard to see Keaton. I had to really seek them out.
Yeah, that guy who went around, you know, getting the rights to his old films was called something like the carrion bird of Hollywood or something because he was really just perching, you know, waiting for these old silent film stars to either die or become incompetent in some way so that he could like swoop down and get their stuff. And so Keaton did not particularly like him as a person, but he was grateful to have him as a business partner because he was saving the films.
And another thing about this transition from, I mean, in Keaton's heyday, the 20s when he was making shorts and comic features, they were amazing. There were other great silent comedians making really wonderful movies, but Keaton was so sui generis. I mean, there was really nothing like it. But when the studios began to acquire talent and consolidate, people like D.W. Griffith and Buster Keaton and Lois Weber, who was the most popular filmmaker in the teens, her movies sold more tickets than almost anyone else's in the late teens. All of them were just, Hollywood didn't want to touch them. The studios didn't want to touch them because they didn't want people who knew what they were doing. They wanted people to boss around.
But a strange irony, though, about these horrible, horrible talkies that Keaton made at MGM in the early sound era, very early sound era, you know, the movies he made from,
Right.
I would say, 1929 to 1933 or something like that, is that they made lots of money at the time for the studio. They were really successful. And I always think about that, how much that must have depressed it. That must have been so, that must have really grated on him, you know, that he was being stuck into these roles that were absolutely wrong for him. And if you see these movies, which I mean, I only recommend if you're a hardcore Keaton head and you want to like dig to the bottom of the well, you see how miserable he is. And some of them you can tell that he's not in good physical shape. You can tell he's drinking too much. They're awful. They're so sad. And yet it had his name on the marquee, and people liked Buster Keaton, and they were marketed by a big, powerful studio, and they were successful. They made more money than any of his silent films did. So that's just a strange irony of his. You know, if he had managed to just white knuckle it through, he could have remained a movie star through the 30s, but he was too unhappy.
And, well, we can talk about that later. Most considerations of Keaton treat him as, you know, this comic savant who didn't anticipate the changes in the movie industry. But it was really, for me, very gratifying to read the book. And I never knew that he mentored Lucille Ball when she was preparing the pilot for her TV show. And a lot of people like Groucho Marx hated Lucille Ball because she didn't write her own material. But Buster Keaton liked her. Why?
The Marx Brothers didn't write their own material. In fact, Buster Keaton wrote a lot of their material.
I know, but that's another very interesting thing about the...
He coached the Marx Brothers. That was one of the things
Yeah.
he did, and he was not particularly fond of them as people. I mean, he
Yeah.
thought they didn't take their work seriously enough. He had such a strong work ethic that he said, they just show up at the last minute and say, what should I do, you know? But he loved Lucille Ball. She was a good friend of his, and she was kind of his protege at MGM. You know, she was kind of a young starlet there who they didn't know what to do with. In his second period at MGM, and I get into this in the book too, after he gets fired, after that humiliating, you know, drunken period that I talked about, he has a few years kind of like wandering in the forest, like trying to make living on the fringes of show business. And then he goes back to MGM as a gag writer. You know, you just imagine going back to the big corporate studio where you were once the top comedy star, and now he's just in the writer's room, like doctoring scripts and things like that. And he was fine with that. He was sort of like keeping his head down for those years, but you know, he was underemployed, that's for sure. And during those years, he befriended Lucille Ball way before she was, you know, TV Lucy. But then when she was trying to become TV Lucy and turn this radio show that she had into a TV show, a kind of a domestic comedy radio show that was very popular, he helped her with the pilot for the show. It was a pilot that never ended up airing, but it had a clown routine in it, which much, much later did make it into an I Love Lucy episode. If you remember, there's an episode where she is a clown playing the cello, and she's auditioning for Ricky's band. It's sort of this, it's like a little vaudeville sketch almost. And he helped her come up with the jokes for that and sort of, you know, coached her through it. So he, in a way, got I Love Lucy on the air. And I love that there's that behind-the-scenes puppetry. You know, he never played a guest role in the show even, which he easily could have. He did a lot of guest stuff on TV, but he was still there behind the scenes.
And I also never knew that he had his own TV show in Los Angeles.
Right. I mean, this is a story about very early television. And here's an example of where the story of his life becomes also the story of, you know, the industry at large, which is that, yeah, he had two different iterations of a show called, I think at first the Buster Keaton Show and then the Buster Keaton Comedy Hour or something slightly different. And it was in 4950, which is very early TV days. So early that many cities in the country they weren't wired for TV. There were actual cities that were called television cities. You know, I think there were 14 of them or something. And other cities, including some major cities like Denver, I think, didn't get TV until way later. So most TV was local, and his shows were local, Los Angeles shows. If you were a really big show, you might possibly get national syndication, and that never happened with either of his two shows for various reasons. But yeah, he tried his hand in almost everything on early TV. He was on Candid Camera, The Twilight Zone, you know, the Donna Reed Show, This Is Your Life. There's a wonderful episode of This Is Your Life, which you can watch on YouTube with Buster Keaton, where they bring people from his past, you know, and he meets some of his old vaudeville compatriots and things like that. He's probably about 55 or something, and if you want to see Buster Keaton cry, he gets kind of misty-eyed in that. But he was everywhere on TV. And in fact, I corresponded with some people in researching who said, people who grew up in a generation, you know, after the silence, and who said, oh, I just thought of him as that funny old guy who was always in gasoline commercials or something like that. You know, like he had a kind of life on TV as a clown that really had nothing to do with his old silence. And
he was in a lot of movies in the late 40s and early 50s, like Sunset Boulevard. He's playing bridge with the other gargoyles.
Right, a tiny part, yeah, two lines.
Or he's in The Good Old Summertime.
He also, can I tell a quick Good Old Summertime story? So that's a musical, an MGM musical from 1949 with Judy Garland. And there's one scene in that was directed by Keaton, even though he's not credited for it. There's a physical comedy scene between Judy Garland and Van Johnson. And if you watch it, you don't even need to know any of the context. You'll know exactly which scene it is because it's full of, you know, crazy gags. And her skirt gets caught in the spokes of his bicycle, and then he rides off, and then she's in her petticoat. And it's this whole goofy slapstick scene. And that was a moment where, you know, he was playing a small part in the movie. He's a behind-the-scenes gag doctor, and it was just sort of like, give it to Keaton, he'll make it funny. You know, like, he should have been directing all that time, and that's the sad thing about that part of his life, is that, you know, there was somebody sitting right there who could have made, you know, a 10 times better movie than Good Old Summertime is, but nobody was asking him to direct.
What do you think, well, first of all, do you have a favorite Buster movie?
I mean, I always change. I guess I would say that my favorite, I say in the book, my favorite feature-length movie is probably Steamboat Bill Jr., which was his last independent movie, so right before he lost his studio. It's also the one with that super famous stunt of the house front that falls on him and he's standing in the window, right? I mean, that's probably his best remembered stunt. But that whole movie is full of really incredible action, physical action, and great character work, too. Just more than a lot of his movies, I think it's about a relationship. It's about a father-son relationship, and about his character kind of reconciling with his, you know, aggressive, burly father, who's a lot like Buster Keaton's aggressive, burly father. So I always feel like he's kind of working out his father issues in that movie, and it's a beautiful movie.
What is Keaton's legacy, do you think?
I mean, I really wanted, at the end of this book, to have a whole chapter that was just about his contemporary presence in the world. It was COVID that kept that from being able to happen, because all these people I wanted to interview and go explore, you know, how their work was being influenced by him. Suddenly, there was no travel, there were no libraries,
right.
And nobody's publicists would answer their calls because they didn't have projects going on.
I'm having that problem right now, too.
But no, I was going to say that in that chapter about his legacy, I wanted to talk to Jackie Chan, right? Great martial artist who's constantly referencing Keaton. To Edgar Wright, the British director who loves Buster Keaton and works physical comedy into his movies in a really unusual and fresh way. But also I would have loved to interview stuntmen. I did interview a couple clowns, and there's a really great quote from a clown in here who became a clown because when he was 9 years old in Paris, he's a French guy, his father took him to see Buster Keaton at a French circus where Keaton was working in the 50s. He was kind of the star of this circus for a few seasons. And this little boy was so impressed and so blown away by this thing that he saw at the circus that he decided right there and then, I'm going to become a clown. And he did. Now he's 65 years old or something, and he's a clowning teacher.
In the movies, Donald O'Connor, who's also a Vaudeville kid, did this great number in Singing in the Rain, Make 'Em Laugh, which is kind of like a Keaton act. Woody Allen's Purple Rose of Cairo is lifted basically from the clip we just saw. I don't know who else. I guess Jackie Chan said that the only things you needed to know for comedy were Buster Keaton and Donald Duck. Mm-hmm. Anyhow, I think we would like to open the conversation to you guys, and please stand up when you ask your question, and I'll repeat it for people in the back who might not be able to hear you. So you're right here. Stand up.
Hi. My daughter couldn't be here tonight, but she's reading your book on Kindle.
Oh, nice. Thank you.
She and a group that she had, I don't know who they were, used to play a Buster Keaton film out in a park, and also someplace in North Philadelphia, where there was a club theater. She played the background.
Oh, that was great.
But she loves Buster Keaton. I think you can see if she's reading the book.
Oh, that's great. Thank you for that.
But she doesn't make different films. So I'm just thrilled with your talk. And what was the film? I know it was Buster Keaton who was hanging on the. Oh, I bought this while we were before we talked. I saw this and I bought this.
DVD.
It comes on what's the fancy way? Blu-ray.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But anyway, what is the film in which he's hanging?
That's not Keaton. It's funny that you asked that because.
That's Harold Lloyd.
But remember when I was saying that before I myself, got on my Keaton binge, that I used to just think, oh, it's those black and white funny guys. People confuse that all the time, and I can't tell you how many conversations I've had, where I tell someone, oh, I'm writing a book on Buster Keaton, right? Over the last 5 years, I'd say this. And they'd say, I love when he hangs from the clock handle, thinking it was Harold Lloyd. Or I love when he eats his shoe, which is Charlie Chaplin in The Gold Rush, And it's natural. I mean, it's not, we're not, if you're not, this is part of why I wanted to write the book. It's like all these guys' legacies are getting mashed up as if there was just sort of one vague funny guy. And in fact, there's this incredibly rich, it's outside those three guys too. There's just, silent comedy and silent drama and this whole world of film history that we don't know enough about.
Did any of his children go into movies?
He had 2 sons, and neither of them went into entertainment at all.
Geraldine Chaplin.
I know, yep.
Who's I think still living.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Definitely.
And still making movies.
Oh yeah, she's fantastic. No, none of his children did, but his great-granddaughter, whose name is Keaton Talmadge, so the name that she has is, those 2 families that married together is now her name. I met her at a Buster Keaton convention, and she performed there, and she's an actress and a singer. I saw her do a one-woman show. She was really good. She's got those wide-set eyes that look a lot like her great-grandfather. So it jumped a few generations, but there is still a performer in the family.
Yes, sir.
You say that the dreadful MGM pictures during the Depression made a lot of money. Right. Enjoyed it. Do you think that Keaton just guilty of overestimating the public taste?
The question is if Keaton's movies for MGM during the Depression made so much money, does Dana think that Keaton was underestimating the public taste? Overestimating the public taste.
I guess the question's a little confusing because he wasn't choosing anything about those movies. Like those movies weren't expressing, he didn't work on the scripts, he didn't develop them at all. So I don't think that his estimation of the public taste went into them as much as Irving Thalberg's, his producer at MGM. It was him who was trying to figure out, how do we market this guy? What roles do we write for this guy? And in fact, the person who could have answered that question was right there, Buster Keaton, but nobody wanted to give him that much power within the studio.
I also think once the studio era came, the studios had these publicity machines. They could reach more people. And then I think...
Yeah, they had very strong marketing arms.
Right.
But Keaton writes about this in his autobiography, which is kind of an as-told-to memoir. It's not really a true autobiography. But he fought those movies. He tried to simplify the plots. He tried to put more action in. He tried to do stunts that they wouldn't let him do because they were too dangerous and they thought he would die. He spent a lot of time fighting with MGM. But like you say, he also had a kind of passive personality. And at a certain point, he didn't want to fight anymore.
Yes, this woman right here. Can you stand up?
Oh.
Great question.
A whole lot of that is in the book. It depends on the contemporaries. Arbuckle, who he first started working with in films, was one of his best friends.
Oh, sorry. This woman asked, what was Buster Keaton's relationship like with his contemporaries? Sorry.
He was friendly with Chaplin and Lloyd. They weren't close social friends or anything like that, but he didn't regard them as competitors, I don't think. And like I said, no one really regarded Chaplin as a competitor because he was so far and above all of them in terms of his wealth and power. But they were really each doing their own thing. And there were many others. We talk about it as if it's these 3 guys, but Max Sennett was off at Keystone making his own different kind of funny movies, and Hal Roach was making his funny movies. And I think they each just sort of felt like I'm pursuing my thing. But he does tell the story that when he went to MGM, when he signed that contract that he calls the worst mistake of my life, that both Lloyd and Chaplin told him not to do it. And it's hard to imagine what circumstance that would be. It must have been just at a party or something, because I don't think they were exactly close friends. But they both went out of their way to say, they're going to they're going to undermine your, faith in your own judgment, and they're going to take your power away from you, and this is a big mistake. And I think he just sort of felt, well, there's nowhere else for me to go. He was very close friends with Roscoe Arbuckle until Roscoe's death. And after the scandal that, ruined Roscoe's career, he kind of kept him on a payroll. He basically gave him some portion of his profits for the rest of his life. In fact, Sherlock Jr. that we just saw a little bit of, Roscoe Arbuckle was originally set to direct, which would have been, him coming back from ignominy, or however you say that word, from, the humiliation.
Ignominy, yeah.
Ignominy of these 3 trials and 2 hung juries and finally acquittal, but I mean, his reputation was completely stained by the scandal. And Keaton offered him a job to directing Sir Sherlock Jr. under a pseudonym, so he could still work without having his name out there. But, and this is a really sad story, as Keaton tells it, apparently Arbuckle, this is a few years out from the scandal, was still kind of, very hard to work with. He was very irritable and angry on set, and that he was moody and just was he wasn't really in it, And so they had to kind of find a tactful way to find him another project and kind of get him off of Sherlock Jr. without making him feel that he'd been rejected. But yeah, their friendship lasted the rest of his life.
How about the Chaplin and Keaton relationship on the Chaplin movie Limelight?
Well, there's a whole chapter about that. Has anybody here seen Limelight, the one time that Chaplin and Keaton worked together from 1952? So I have a whole chapter about that movie, even though I really don't like Limelight. But it's a fascinating convergence in both of their lives. It's a moment when Keaton's career is gradually on its way back up from that low time I was talking about. And Chaplin, who has just been, at the top of global fame for the whole century until then, is just about to have this big fall where he leaves the United States and exiles himself to Switzerland and, has all this trouble with the government and the House Un-American Activities Committee. And that's a whole story that you can read about in the book. But the fact that their 2 ships crossed at that moment, and in this movie that is specifically a very autobiographical movie for Chaplin, of Chaplin trying to look deeply into his own career and his own life, it makes it a really fascinating document, even if it's sort of an awful movie. So, yeah, if you read the book, you're going to read a lot about Limelight.
Yeah, that's a very interesting chapter. One more question. Oh, no. Yes, back there.
I've got a couple things that I'll make it quick. Number one, there's another family member that acted dated her in the early 80s.
Huh?
Was she a granddaughter?
The name of the film, she was a niece to Buster Keaton. And she lived in Beverly Hills, very not far from Buster Keaton.
Oh, so she was Harry Keaton's daughter. Okay.
That's correct. So she did that. Also, you mentioned the Twilight Zone episode. If you've never seen that episode or see it, it's amazing because it really starts like the 1890s as an adventure, and then it goes to modern times where it's sound, and then goes back to the silent, and how much better things were back in the 1890s, let's say, as opposed to back in the early 60s. By that Twilight Zone here. But listening to you talk about the book, starting back then and going forward, it really sounds a lot like very autobiographical, and probably a lot of input in that.
Yeah.
How that book ended up working out.
Yeah.
There's an invention in there, so you mentioned, taking apart camera. They actually take apart time machine.
Right.
So it sounded very much like.
Yeah, I talk about that. And in fact, how ironically, the character he plays in that Twilight Zone episode wants to go back in the end to the 1890s, right? He's a time traveler, and at the end he says, you know what, it was better in the 1890s, I'll go back. But I write about how the real life Keaton would never have said that. He liked being in the now. He really did. He loved the future and technology and the next coming thing.
And he was an early adapter.
Totally, yeah.
All of the Buster Keaton Arbuckle stories are available to they have them on 2 or 3 DVDs.
Yeah, that's a really
it's
good.
a fantastic set.
Something else I was going to say about that, if you read the book, though, and I should have put this in the introduction and I didn't, but almost all these movies I talk about are easy to find streaming for free. If you want to see the good quality and the great extras, you should buy those DVDs, and they're completely worth it. But the public domain is not the public domain for nothing. It's pretty amazing that all of this great art is just out there streaming for free. Like, you are a few Google searches away from seeing almost every movie I talk about, including the non-Keaton ones. So I really encourage people, and this is how my brother read the book, and I love this. It took him forever to read it because he just kept stopping and watching everything along the way.
Thank you. This has been wonderful. Thank you, Dana, for being here with us. In just 1 minute, I am going to usher Dana to the back. Carly and Christina are here with Head House Books. You can buy a copy of the book and Dana will sign it. But I'm going to take her to the back, so don't try to rush her up here if you want to talk with her, right? We're going to get her to the back for that.
One more thing I wanted to say before we start is that I just took a COVID test like minutes before we talked, and I'm negative. So if anybody wants to come get signed, you don't have to worry about me, breathing on you.
But before I take her really quickly, there's so many programs this week on, and I don't want you to miss them. On Thursday, we are doing a virtual program with Dr. Timothy Sweet from the University of Virginia on how humanity plays into biodiversity and extinction narratives. Should be a fascinating conversation. And then on Saturday, come back here, but register ahead of time, please. Sam Katz, our own Philadelphia very famous person, in conversation with Jim Gardner. Sam Katz won the Library of Congress Ken Burns Award for his most current documentary on Detroit and the bankruptcy at Detroit. It has not been released yet. He has been frantically trying to finish it since he got that Ken Burns Award. He will be here. We will have a showing of that documentary, and then he will be in conversation about it with Jim Gardner before Jim retires. So this is a great chance to see.
It's a great movie.
Yeah, so it's a great chance to see two great people. So please register for those. Register for our other programs, virtual and in person. We look forward to seeing you all again, whether you're a member or it's your first time here. And let us thank again Carrie Rickey in conversation with Dana Stevens, and buy Dana's book.